Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IHR Digital History Seminar. I'm just noting that now we are live online and we'll be putting this session on YouTube afterwards. My name is Alice Kinghorn, and I'm delighted to be the chair for this evening's postgraduate panel, the first of two which showcase new research coming from our postgraduate community. This is a panel that I'm incredibly excited for, as this is how I first came to present my research at the Digital History Seminar. Tonight we have two different papers from University College London and from the University of Washington, which will hopefully result in a rich discussion at the end of both papers through a Q&A session. So a few notes of admin before we begin. We're going to have both papers back to back, each lasting around 15 minutes, which will hopefully give us enough time to have an in-depth discussion at the end. During the Q&A, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button in Teams where you will be able to type and post your questions. So without further ado, we will start with the first of our papers from Darren Reid, who is a PhD candidate at University College London. Here he studies how imperial networks functioned in settler colonial spaces, and his current project looks at the Aborigines Protection Society through the lens of colonial informants. Darren is also a web developer and game designer. Today, Darren is presenting on video games as public history, using game design to disseminate historical research to diverse audiences. So I will now hand over to Darren.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm going to get my screen sharing set up here. There, right there. And all right, thank you everyone for coming to my presentation on video games as public history. First, I just wanted to make sure that my audio is working. Can everybody hear me? I don't see access to my Teams actually, so I'll assume you can hear me. And I'll jump right in and begin with saying that historical video game studies has become a thriving field in the past decade, and that historians have been particularly busy analyzing Assassin's Creed and Civilization. And as a side note, I would humbly request that anyone thinking of writing another paper on these games to please choose literally any other game. I think the market's a little bit saturated and there's so much rich historical video game content to look at besides these two. But regardless, while historians have industriously taken to discussing commercial history games like Civilization and Assassin's Creed, we've so far largely failed to take up game development as a means of disseminating our own research to audiences uninterested in traditional outputs like text documents or videos. And it might not have to be like this. Contrary to common conceptions that game development requires large budgets and advanced programming skills, there's a wide variety of free and relatively easy to learn development tools like Twine at the very bottom, GameMaker in the middle, and even Unity for those who are ambitious. And I have a vision of the next generation of historians utilizing these tools to become indie historical game developers, capable of making their own research more accessible to wider audiences. And the question really remains, is my vision realistic, or am I vastly underestimating the difficulty of game development? So to answer that question, I've spent the past year creating Abuno Sanguine, which is a browser game based on my dissertation. And today I offer some reflections on the process in the hopes of sparking more interest in the idea of producing scholarly history games. And I've organized this presentation according to the ADDIE process of game production, which flows from analyzing the purpose of the game, designing the mechanics and the rules, developing the assets, implementing the game within target audiences, and then evaluating the impact. So after briefly surveying each of these stages of my game production journey, I'll conclude with a couple of key lessons I've learned, which I think will be useful for future historian developers. So the first stage of the ADDIE process entails identifying your target audience and determining the objectives of the game. And as with any public history project, for me, this meant putting aside what I thought was significant about my research and identifying what was useful for my stakeholders. So my research, it centers around late 19th century Indigenous rights activists in Britain's settler colonies, so Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. And it looks at people who wrote letters to the Aborigines Protection Society in England to challenge colonial oppression in their communities. And as such, the one big group of stakeholders in my research are modern Indigenous rights activists who have an interest in understanding the flaws and the failures of those activists who came before them. So while I would have ideally liked to have some consultation with my stakeholders, as this was mostly a hobby project, I personally reflected on how modern activists might benefit from my research. And I decided that by highlighting the social pressures that prevented the Aborigines Protection Society from achieving any meaningful success in the past, they're largely known as a failure. I decided that my research can contribute to historical consciousness and empathy with past activists to help modern activists reflect on whether similar social pressures limit their own work. So having determined my objective and my audience, the next phase of production is design. And this required me to determine appropriate game mechanics and rules for conveying to players the social pressures that prevented the Aborigines Protection Society from achieving success. And I determined on a role-playing mechanic in which players role-play as the secretary of the Aborigines Protection Society, as I thought it would be an excellent way to express what the society was and the rules and restrictions it operated within. And given that the duties of the secretary was to review and respond to letters it received from colonial activists, I was immediately drawn to the popular game Papers, Please as inspiration for what my game could look like. For those who don't know, Papers, Please places players in the role of an immigration officer in a fantasy world meant to represent Soviet-era Eastern Europe, where as characters pass through an immigration checkpoint, the player is required to grant or refuse entry based on rules dictated by this fictional Department of Immigration. And what really drew me to Papers, Please was how the mechanic of granting or rejecting entry to a country is analogous to the historical process by which the Aborigines Protection Society granted or rejected support to Indigenous petitions. And I felt that the rules imposed in Papers, Please by the Ministry of Immigration could be translated into rules placed by society on the Secretary of the Aborigines Protection Society. So I decided to utilize a mechanic where, as Secretary of the Society, petitions would pass over the desk of the player, and the player must continuously consult changing social norms and rules in order to balance the society's income, political influence, reputation, and member satisfaction. And by attempting to strike this nearly impossible balance, players would develop historical consciousness of how 19th century activism worked and empathy with what it was like to fight for Indigenous rights in a society that was almost actively hostile to people believed to be biologically inferior. So having designed my mechanics, the next stage development was to make the game. I decided to make the game in the Twine game engine, which many of you may be aware of as a platform for writing interactive text-based narratives. But that's not all it can do because it's based on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you have some basic web design skills, you can essentially use Twine to make anything you want. And it's also great for those wary of diving into complex worlds of game design because it's essentially building a website, an interactive and narrative-based website. So it's very accessible. And after I coded my game mechanics largely in JavaScript, but heavily using CSS as well. The next step was to generate my assets. I created my assets by copying real-world historical artifacts by using both manual SVG art as well as automated SVG art. So manual SVGs involves using vector graphics. I used Adobe Illustrator to recreate historical images by hand using lines and shapes. And you can see example on the left-hand side of a document I made by hand copying a real-life document. Automated SVG art uses image tracing tools to vectorize existing images. So that you can see on the right-hand side, a historical engraving that would have taken me way too much time to recreate by hand. So I automatically traced the lines and created an SVG. And there are pros and cons to using both methods that I don't have enough time to talk about at this moment, but if you're interested in asset creation, feel free to ask me later on. Once I had coded my mechanics and created my graphics, the next stage was implementing this sort of alpha version of Abuno Sanguine to my target audience in a scaffolded manner, which is very important. And I did this through a 3-week-long social media campaign because my target audience of Indigenous rights activists are very accessible through existing groups like Facebook groups around decolonization or Twitter, using Twitter hashtags around truth and reconciliation and Indigenous rights. And so you can see some examples of the posts I used on this slide here. And you might be able to, I don't know if you can actually read it, but they provide scaffolding in 2 different ways. First, visually, my posts utilize graphics comparing real historical images to their in-game reproductions to sort of nudge people into realizing the historical nature of the game content, that they're not just playing a fantasy game, they're playing a game that has connotations to reality. But then second, and more importantly, textually, I present questions connecting the game's issues to modern Indigenous rights activism to prompt players into thinking about these historical issues when they play the game. So for example, the one on the right here says, the Aborigines Protection Society's income and expenses in the game are based on real treasury reports, which it demonstrates, or it gives a picture of it, and then asks, how do you think the availability of funding impacted 19th century Indigenous rights activism, and does it impact it today? So it's trying to nudge people as they start playing to start thinking about implications and not just play it frivolously or just for fun. And then the final stage, which was the most problematic, is evaluation, where I originally planned to do my evaluation of impact by analyzing comments on my game's webpage, because this is how many scholars assess the impact of video games on public audiences. Well, however, I discovered that this is not a very useful method for small-scale games, because while scholars study very popular commercial games, thousands and thousands of comments, after 2 months and 600 playthroughs, I've not gotten a single comment on my game, which is very frustrating. And for my own purposes, it's not the worst thing in the world, because this is a sort of a hobby project with no funding body to report to. However, this is an important finding and important caution that for anyone hoping to use game development on a more formal public history project, to really consider implementing more rigorous evaluation methodologies, which I have brainstormed various different methods that I'll employ on my next version of the game, which I, again, don't have too much time to go over, but I welcome you to ask me later on. So yeah, big flop in terms of evaluating my impact. But although I have learned many other things about the experience from making Abuno Sanguine, there are 2 in particular that I think will help both guide my next version of the game and prove useful for future historian developers. And the first one is that asset generation was by far the most time-consuming and headache-inducing part of the game production process, which surprised me. I originally anticipated coding the game mechanics to be the most difficult, but that was nothing compared to creating, editing, and re-editing on multiple iterations of my game to more than 400 SVG files that eventually made up Arduino Sanguine. And with hindsight, there were various things I could have done to drastically reduce this colossal headache, such as replacing some SVGs with CSS, in which case I wouldn't have had to individually trace each letter, for example, in my game. I could have had a template letter with HTML and CSS controlling the text. I could have tweaked my game mechanics to involve fewer assets. For example, instead of having players analyze small bits of many letters, I could have had them analyze more in-depth, less letters to reduce the amount of assets. Or I could have outsourced asset creation to a graphic designer on websites like Fiverr, or by finding a student at my university. So however it's done, I would strongly encourage future historian developers to seriously consider ways to reduce their asset requirements. Otherwise, it's just a pain in the butt. The second lesson I learned was that players needed significantly more signposts in the game to flag the historical information embedded in the game. I put a lot of effort into researching every aspect of the past that I was representing. For example, at the end of every level, there's a ledger showing the society's income and expenses, and players must balance their budget to stay solvent. And they essentially win if after 4 levels, they haven't gone bankrupt, which is very difficult. And the range of incomes that players can accrue, as well as the cost of expenses, are all based on the society's treasury records. And the difficulty level of staying solvent is also based on real historical difficulties that 19th century humanitarians experienced over the course of the century. And all of that detail was designed to simulate the decline of humanitarian sentiments and showcase how activists were more or less forced to sacrifice moral ideals in the interest of maintaining donations from an increasingly apathetic society. Yet, during my playtests, I realized that players had no way of knowing any of this information, which it was information that I knew and was quite obvious to me, but for them it was often confusingly frustrating why they had such a difficult time winning the game, when for me that was the whole point. And they also had no way of knowing that all the numbers in the game are real, or that people in the game are real. They hadn't had any way of knowing this. So I would encourage both me in my next version and any future historian developer to include methods of signposting historical context and information into the game design process before they make the game, rather than trying to find some way to fix it after they've already made the problem. Predictably, though, producing Ab Uno Sanguine took me longer than I anticipated. I originally planned on a production timeline of around 6 months, working a couple hours every weekend. And in reality, it took closer to a year, which for some is probably too long. But if you reduce the amount of assets to create, it was significantly shorter than that timeline. But from my perspective, it was a year well spent, because even though I made huge errors, especially in terms of evaluation, which prevent me from identifying if I've even achieved my objectives, at the very least, there's at this moment 600 people who have played the game and now know about the Aborigines Protection Society, who previously probably had no idea what it was. But I think more importantly, that I hope by sharing this case study of my experiences and the lessons I learned, I hope I could have helped prevent future historian developers from making the same errors as I did. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Darren, for sharing such rich research with some thought-provoking insights into the creation of video games for historical research. So I'm now going to move straight on to our second paper of the panel this evening from Devin Short, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Washington. Devin's thesis looks at the history of climate modelling in the United States from 1960 to 2000. Prior to embarking on a history PhD, Devin completed a master's in nuclear science. Today, Devin is presenting the paper, Picking Your Mess, Designing a Database System for Historical Scholarship, which I believe will consider the types of input that can make inputting historical data so challenging. So I will now hand over to Devin.
Can you hear me? There we go. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Great. Sorry, my computer's being a little bit slow. So I have to say, my family finally got COVID last week, so I'm doing better, but I might be a little bit slow in a couple of places here. Okay, so thanks very much. I'm talking about designing a database here, and historians can sometimes have some skepticism about handling a lot of data at once in sort of a kind of big data type context, which is what I'm getting into here, is creating databases of a large amount of historical content. And the problem people usually encounter is that when you want to create a database, you need to clean the data. So that means making multiple values that should refer to the same thing look the same. And that destroys information. So for instance, people have a lot of different ways they represent their names. And if we replace all those values with a single string, then we're destroying a lot of ambiguity that historians might be interested in. And what I want to do is create a system that historians can use to preserve those ambiguities and promote better research using something like a database. And so this is all very abstract, and what I want to do is anchor this in my my dissertation work before we kind of get into the database system. So I studied the history of computer modeling in US climate science. And my biggest question is just how has this work gotten done? And how has that work changed over time? So the basic situation in the history of climate science right now is that we have a lot of information about the context. So people have written about the infrastructure that does this, that supports climate scientists. People have written about things like the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body that provides a lot of the sort of linkage between scientists and global politics. And then we also have a lot of scholarship about the history of computing and sociology of computing. And so the situation is kind of like we have a lot of information about about kinds of kitchens. So people have a lot of equipment in these kitchens, people have a lot of things coming in and out of the kitchen, but we don't really know what people do in the kitchen once they get there. And so what I'm interested in doing is figuring out how people use models, what does it mean to run a model, and how have they used and maintained these things over time as the work changes. And right now, we don't even have a good way to say who has made climate models. So I can go ask well-known researchers, and we have oral histories from a lot of these folks. But as a historian, you need to be able to look at these things critically, which means we can't just take their word for it, right? It's not that we don't trust our sources, but we don't suggest that somebody's memory is as good as a more complete historical record. But I can't go look up a list of climate modelers, even in the US, even at one lab. And so what I'm going to start looking at is the publication record. And historians of science frequently use publications not as sort of final stop sources, but as a way to scaffold answers to research questions. So you do things like periodize work in history of science by looking at how publications have come out. You can sort of find important places or important ideas or important groups by finding publications that people had thought were very important. And this turns out to be quite a large task for climate modeling. So there's two major climate modeling centers in the US, but other people have done it. And if I just focus on those two major modeling centers, there's about 10,000 papers that are relevant, and each of those are something like 10 pages each. There's hundreds of authors and non-author workers, so staff and technical support workers. And there's multiple institutions surrounding these, so scientists could work at a university, but then publish at a lab where they're collaborating. And then this is very dynamic. Authors move into institutions, they move between them. And I want to be able to track those kinds of changes over time. And so the trouble here is that if we're going to investigate the community of modelers, and we're going to try and understand the dynamics of how these scientists have worked, we need a method to model the community. And I don't mean by this that we're going to somehow simulate people's behavior like they do with simulating a climate system. I want you to think much more about an architectural model in this case. So I want something that I can sort of put in front of me and turn around, sort of look at where the nooks and crannies are, where I need more texture, where there might be something interesting to sort of follow out. And so it gives you this really high-level view of something that's much more complicated. And so that's sort of the task here. And I think, for people watching this video, probably we have some familiarity with database structure, but I want to get us kind of all on one page here. And so just a basic question, what is a database? A database is just something that helps you find links between pieces of information. So if I go to my library's website and I search for an author, I don't want the website to tell me, yes, this author exists. What I want is for the website to say, this author has written these things, or these things exist in this shelf on the stacks. So I'm not searching for an item that I'm inputting into the database. I'm searching for things that are linked to that item. That's the purpose of sort of organizing things into a database. So let's think about representing two different sources in a database as just an example. So there's a 1984 paper from two authors that are meteorologists. This is a scientific paper, and then James Fleming is a historian of science who wrote a book called First Woman. So this is a Chicago-style citation. This is what we might see in a historical source. If we want to make this represented in a database, the simplest way to do this is called a flat file. And so that's a spreadsheet. And we immediately sort of run into a problem here, which is that in a database, everything should have every kind of cell in one of these files should have exactly one piece of information in it. But there's two authors for this publication that was the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences, in the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences. And so in a flat file, that means this one source needs to be split into two lines so that we can represent both authors independently. And of course, for a single author publication, we can just use one line in a flat file. And so you can see that this becomes really inefficient very quickly. I think this is obvious. And the sort of next step in complexity is to use what's called a relational database. And so in this case, what we have is a table that defines a set of works. And so I have two publications that I showed you before. And then there's a list of actors somewhere. And so we have three people. And then you have other tables that should define relations between things in this case, works and actors. And so we have an authors table. There's work one has two authors, work two has one author. And so each line in each of these tables has its own ID number, which means that it can then be referenced in any other table. And so this is the sort of crux of a relational database. What you do is have places where you store, in this case, string values, and then you have other tables where you combine references to those sources together. And so this can become very, very complicated. It can stay sort of this simple where you just have a few tables. But the point is that this allows you to just store the data in one place and then give pretty complicated relations between those things in a set of other places. And so that's kind of the basic structure of what a database is. And so now I want to say, like, how can we use something like a database to answer questions in a history of science, And again, like when we're talking about climate modeling, we are missing really basic information, like who has done climate modeling. And so just a flat file would immediately give us an answer to who's involved here. If I could get a flat file of all of these 10,000 papers, then I could just get a list of people. That would be helpful. I can also start looking at co-authorship with something as simple as a flat file. And if I you start plotting links between people. So if each one of these circles is a person, and each one of these links is indicates that they wrote a paper together, I can start identifying clusters of people. And then if we do this in a time resolved way, that we can start looking at the way those clusters change over time. If I also started tracking citations between different papers, then I can start looking at additional structure in these networks. You can find links between sort of disconnected groups of authors. You can start finding sort of common things that people read that might be influences from the past. And then if we continue to sort of add useful information here, the thing that I'm going to be doing that's new compared to any other study that I'm aware of like this is that I'm going to include information from acknowledgements. So I want to include acknowledgements as a class of citation. The way to do is to start looking for people who were not considered worthy of authorship. And so stories like Hidden Figures, I think, are very familiar now, where in the 1960s and earlier, people like computers, so the people that were doing work with calculation, were often under-recognized. And in the case of Hidden Figures, there were a lot of Black women that were working at NASA that were never recognized for the work that they were doing. And in the scientific community, that means they're not listed as authors. And so if I can include this information from acknowledgements, then I can start saying, I can start finding people who link these communities together. And so we can use a complex database of research papers in the sciences to actually start tracking communities in a complex way and not just looking at these sources. But the problem here is that this is a big study, first of all. So this is an example of a citation network. This is papers now, not people. This is my sort of proof of concept that I can get a lot of this information in one place, and I can start to see interesting patterns here. And as just an example, this is a network of citations from papers at one of the labs that I'm interested in. And you can see that there's some time structure here. So, you know, papers that are written longer ago, the color scale here is the time scale. The darker papers are older papers. You get clustering that's sort of time resolved. There's lighter areas where people are working together more recently, and darker areas where people were working together or ready together longer ago. But you can also get some interesting qualitative information here. So these bright dots are the two sort of most important climate modelers from this lab. And if you start looking at a few of the papers in this cluster, these clusters, you can start to find topic areas here. This is called a force-directed graph. I'm not going to get into the details, but we could talk about it afterwards if people want. And so if we can get enough of this information in one place, then we can actually start to see large-scale patterns and things that need to be explained. So what's going on in this cluster of papers, for instance, where we have these older papers that are connected to newer ones, but they're sort of more tightly connected together, and how do those dynamics work within these topical communities? These are the sorts of questions that historians can start to ask and find interesting answers to. But again, there's this practical problem that there's a huge amount of information that needs to get added. The plots that I just showed you included online citation indexes. Hello? I'm hoping you can still hear me. I just heard
we can still hear you.
Okay, good. So there are online citation indexes that we can use to get information about scientific publications, but they're very sparse. So even in the late 1980s, almost all the citation information goes away out of these indexes because they're just not, no one has transcribed them. And so I can get a lot of that programmatically. I can call out with a program to get that information, but I need to enter a ton of data manually. And products like Zotero, so this is a citation manager, other databases that you can download and use are really, really bad for this because you have to click through a menu for each part of each citation. They actually don't have like convenient ways to track citations usually, so you have to sort of invent a tag system, and it's just not practical. So what I need is a new method to manually enter a lot of data. And my basic approach is to do design structured strings that will allow me to quickly write down all the information that represents a single paper. So an author list, a year, a publication, a volume, a page. This is an example of one of these structured strings. I can then pair the strings up in a comma-separated file. So this will autofill down in the scripts that I've written. So each one of these lines should be a pair of these entries. So there's one entry here and a second entry here that's paired with that one, a third entry here that's also paired with this one. And what I can do is write a script that interprets this as a citation. So you have all the bibliographic data for one paper here, all the bibliographic data for a second paper here, and it interprets this as a citation when they appear together. So this is a first step. That's how I generated those, some of the manual entry for the plots that you saw above. But this isn't good enough for like a sort of robust historical source, because one pass through the sources isn't good enough. If I just come up with a list of citations, then I'm immediately going to ask for other patterns. You know, what other information is here? I also want to track acknowledgements. Should I go through and do citations in one pass and acknowledgements in a second one? It's just not good enough to have that strict relationship between two of these entries that says that's a citation. The other problem is that people have different, again, people can have different names is the simplest case. Joanne Simpson is a very famous meteorologist. She had 4 names that she published under. I'm not sure she published under her maiden name, Gerald, but she published under 3 other names. So one way to handle this is to say, if there's a sort of an item separator, if there's a delimited item in one of these strings, then it's a work. And it should be interpreted as a citation. And if there's no delimiter, these double underbars, then this is something that should be an acknowledgement. So in this case, if this was my data file that I had written by hand, then I would say, here's one work. That work acknowledges NASA and a grant number. It cites this work, and it acknowledges Joanne Simpson. And then as I'm reading through this file and transcribing this information, then I would also keep track of a second file that's aliases. So the name Simpson J is an alias for Joanne Gerald. It's also an alias for Joanne Starr. NASA is an alias for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. That is fine if I only care about acknowledgements and citations. But there's a lot of other relationships that are important here, and I don't know ahead of time what they are. So the most general way to do this is to have a pair of entries, a link type, and then a reference entry. And the reference is the context in which the link appears. And so I'm reading a reference. The reference has a statement about a link between 2 items. And this represents that entire relationship. So an example would be Alice says Bob married Charlie. And so Alice is my reference, married is the link type, and Bob married Charlie. When I'm transcribing a paper, some of this can be jettisoned because citations are the normal link that I'm looking at, and the paper that is the source is also the reference. And so in a lot of cases, you could just ignore these second 2 and say paper A cited paper B when you're transcribing these files. And so this gets complicated, but I can write scripts that will then, that will first of all take prefixes for these entries, and then second, parse out items within substrings. So if this acknowledgement is a list of people, then I can make an acknowledgement from this whole entry to each item in this list. Or if I have a list of institutions that should be affiliations, then I can say author 1 is affiliated with institution 1, author 2 is affiliated with institution 2. I don't mean to bog us down with this, but the point is that you can have customizable links and customizable entries. These things are all defined in configuration files. They're not hard-coded into the database system that I'm designing. So the upshot of all of this is that I can read through one file, which is the PDF, say, for this, which is the PDF for this source. I can write down the affiliation. I can write down some citations. So maybe these are footnotes that are occurring on one page. Then there's some acknowledgements at the end, maybe. So there's I can transcribe the acknowledgement. I can design an entry format for notes. and then I can name myself as the reference entry for that. And so the important thing here is that these are very flexible entry methods, and they can be entered into a flat file as I'm reading through the sources, which means that the entry method is tailored to reading through a source and collecting information for really complicated relationships. So each one of these entries has to get parsed out into a complex set of relationships. So if a work has an author, a year, a publication, a volume, a page, that's a bunch of links that have to be created inside of some kind of a database. And so my point here is just that if I have an entry that's supposed to be interpreted as the source for a citation to another entry, that's sort of 5 lines in a flat file per entry, and then another line for a citation in some kind of a flat file. So what that means is that one of these lines here is equivalent to something like 11 flat file or 11 rows in a spreadsheet. And that means that I'm reducing my data entry load by like an order of magnitude at least. But the trick here is that we need to be able to preserve these ambiguities. So in a case that a historian might be interested in here is that we might have a set of letters. We have some more publications. They don't have any citations in them. One of these letters is from Victor Starr to Joanne Gerold. Victor Starr is Joanne Gerold's first husband. We have a letter from the University of Chicago to Mrs. Victor Starr. And then we have a couple of publications from Simpson. Now, I run into another source from 1985 in which this author is referring to Simpson as Mrs. Joanne Malkus and Mrs. Joanne Simpson when they're making these citations. That's a moment that a historian cares about, right? So first of all, Chicago has written a letter to Mrs. Victor Starr. That's not her name, and given her history with Starr, she would not be very happy to receive a letter like that. We can also start to make some inferences about Smith if he's referring to Simpson this way in 1985. But this is a really complex set of names. Even if I track my aliases here, I need some way to make this queryable. I want to be able to say, if I search for Joanne Simpson in a database, I want to be able to retrieve all of this information. And if I make this as simple as possible, then it would just be sort of Joanne Simpson has received letters from University of Chicago. She's received letters from Victor Starr. And she was cited by John Smith. But each of these names somehow needs to be abstracted into some kind of an object that will, first of all, allow me to query Joanne Simpson, but then also allow me to find out that John Smith wrote about Mrs. Joanne Malkus instead of Joanne Malkus, or that the University of Chicago wrote a letter to Mrs. Victor Starr and not Joanne Simpson. And so I've designed a data model that does this. It's quite abstract, and I think I'm already over time here, but the point is that you can represent Joanne Simpson as an abstract object that I'm calling a node, and note edges between the nodes. And so if this is a node for Joanne Simpson, John Smith has a relationship with that node. But using this data model, I can then back out what a source said about that node. And so it preserves this relationship where John Smith calls Joanne Simpson Mrs. Joanne Malkus, while allowing me to use this abstract simplified version where I can just search for Joanne Simpson and find her relationships to University of Chicago, Victor Starr, or John Smith. And similarly, I could search for Joanne Malkus and get this same relationship. It's no longer tied to the specific name representation. So this got into the weeds about a lot of sort of nitty-gritty things about data entry, but the thing that that's important about Bibliograph, which is the database that I've designed to do this, is that these single string entries, they represent things that don't have a name. So this is a paper, but I don't name the paper. I name the things the paper is related to. This is really important for historians. I have a colleague who does a lot of work with a diary from a doctor in a British colony. This doctor frequently referred to his patients with slurs instead of names. And so if we want to track those individual patients, we would need to be able to design some kind of an entry that would let us say the person referred to on page 5 with some other demarcating information so that we could know exactly what which actors are represented in that source and maybe start to track them through that source and into others. Second, the input format is totally customizable, and it's determined. It determines the content of the database. So if you can design a way to enter the data you want to enter, the database is created based on the entry format. So this doesn't now tie you to an interface like Zotero or something. It allows you to design a way to enter the data, your workflow, and then it creates a database for you. And finally, this approach lets you start to argue that questions are interesting. And this might not be immediately obvious, but if I want to say this person is important to this network. So again, this was a person acknowledged when we were looking at these blue links before were acknowledgements. I'm going to say this person is acknowledged and in 2 different papers from 2 different communities. And that means this person bridges these 2 communities in some meaningful way. And that allows me to argue that that person is significant to a larger historical study and not just a name that I found in an archive that should be pursued. And so finally, I know I'm way over time. The takeaways I have here are that historians and other scholars are already doing this work. I'm not asking you to pick up this tool and do something you're not already doing. What I'm asking is that people should make this work explicit. What kinds of nodes are you looking at? Are you looking at actors and papers? Are you looking at locations, materials that people produce? You can design nodes and links that represent those things. You just need to make it explicit in order to use this database. And if we can make that kind of work explicit, we could start collaborating in much more practical ways, I think. Right now, most of us work by ourselves in archives or libraries. But if we can make these entry formats explicit and we can demonstrate how to use them, then we can start sharing them. And it's very easy using this data model to take 2 different people's databases and just combine them together immediately. And so if they're using the same link types and node types, they can immediately start collecting this information together and start finding patterns, overall patterns in data that they have collected independently or sources that they're using independently. And finally, this is adaptable for projects across the humanities. Like I said, there's an example from a colleague of mine where he's working with a diary, has nothing to do with the history of science. And this is a single source that has detailed information that might have links to all kinds of other sources in this colonial context where he's working. So thank you for following me into the weeds there. There are a couple of links here if you would like to look at either my website or the website for the Python package that I have designed to implement this. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Devin. And thank you both for 2 really wonderful papers. I've certainly learned a lot. I think they both demonstrated the ways that digital history can be used to reach new audiences and also scholars in different fields. So thank you both. If anybody in the audience has any questions for either of our speakers, then please pop them in the Q&A chat now. I have a question that actually I think James has asked as well. It's for Darren about the historical context of your games and how much historical context is needed. So my question is there any way to know how much historical context is needed? Is there any limit on how much a player of this game needs to know? Because I'm assuming there's a huge difference between studying for a PhD in the topic like you are and somebody that is generally interested in the topic. So could you expand on the historical context problem that you faced?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And also worded from James, I was thinking about that as well. So first, since I already prepared my answer to James, I'll start with that specific one, but I'll also talk about what you raised as well. What James in the comments sort of asked about was the difference between games with scholarly intent and games with public history intents, which there's a lot of slippage. Like sometimes I call my thing a public history game, sometimes I call it a scholarly game. But if you think of it in terms of an analogy with what we do have, let's say an article, a peer-reviewed article is an analogy for a game with scholarly intent. It's designed for historians or for scholars to propose an original idea, to engage with historiography, or to model an event to learn from it, versus a magazine article or something that's not peer-reviewed, that's for public intent, that it's not about engaging with debates, it's about sharing findings or working collaboratively with your audience if you're able to. Then for that example, it's very important to distinguish between the two, because if we as historians didn't know the difference between a peer-reviewed article and a magazine, we'd be lost and have so many issues going on. So I do think on one hand, it is important to develop proper terms so that there isn't this slippage, because I do think it's important. But it's not only important for consumers, it's also important in the design process, because you need to, in the first stage of determining your objective and your audience, you need to know, okay, are you designing this for scholars, in which case they need to have certain amount of information. They probably would like to know how you obtain information, or what your background, your theoretical background is. They would want that sort of thing. Whereas for public, they probably don't care, and you're going to lose them if you give them too much information. And that also blends in to what you asked about how much information to give. And that I also think that there's different ways to look at that question. If you look at your objectives, like how much context do my readers or my players need to get what I'm telling them? Well, that's an important question where I think you need to work through playtesting and to ask people, okay, you played my game, what did you learn? And if they didn't learn anything, you're like, okay, I know that I need to get some more information, or I know I need to work through something. But then you can also think it through the idea of game types and fun, because games that aren't fun are not going to be played and no one's going to learn anything. So if you overload people with details, they're not going to play the game. Unless it's a game designed to be read like, I can't think of one on top of my head, but there's plenty of text-based games where the whole point is you read walls of text and you think about it and you solve a riddle or something like that. So you can design a game that enables reading a whole bunch of context or being presented with context is fun, but if you don't choose a game type like that, then you're not going to get an audience. So I think there's different ways to do that, but having your intended objectives and your audience in mind is, I think, the most important part. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. The next question we have is from Kelvin Beer-Jones, and I'm assuming that this is for Devin, but please correct me if I'm wrong. And the question is, two questions. Have you created an authority index, and have you worked with any archivists on development standards?
It's a great question. So the input format that you design can generate an authority index for you, essentially. So I have a node type called actor, and that corresponds to something like authority in say the international authority file. It's also quite easy. Well, not quite easy, but it's straightforward to download something like to use the API for VIAF, for instance, which is one of the international authority files. To use their API and just give them query all of the names that are in my database and pull down the VIAF numbers for all of them. And so one of the really helpful things about a database like this is that it's extensible on the fly, basically. So I can, given the list of authorities or actors or names or whatever you want to call them that you have in your database, if you hand them to somebody who can write a script, then you can just pull down the VIAF numbers for them and you just make that an input file and then breed it into the database. And so I'm not currently using those, but I have anticipated building them into the database should someone want to. Does that answer your question?
I don't know if they have access to their mic, but I'm going to say that that was a good answer. It was great, thank you. So the next question is from me again, is for you, Devin, and it's about your acknowledgement of acknowledgements in journal articles. And I was just wondering if you have any sort of scale for those acknowledgements in terms of what they're acknowledging. For example, do reading and comments result in acknowledgements, or is it only if they're kind of linked to a grant and research that has been done? And if so, are you tracking that?
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of the sort of important findings, I guess, you could get out of a study like this. So I think one of the things that's really important for people who aren't familiar with scientific publishing, especially in the mid to late 20th century, is that this is always extremely collaborative. So by the 1940s, you hardly ever had people in the natural sciences publishing alone. And so these collaborative networks get really complicated, and deciding who is an author and who is not is this whole thing. So there's this edge sometimes where somebody might have been an author in a different research group, but in this research group they acknowledge them instead. Different papers will have sort of, they're all very structured, and so some of them have specific points where they say this is a funder, and somebody like me might just say that's an acknowledgement as I'm typing through. I've designed an entry type for funders, so you can do this in different ways, but I think it's not totally clear, and it depends on the community. The communities have different standards for how they consider people to be worthy of acknowledgement or authorship or whatever. It can change substantially between disciplines or even subdisciplines. And so there isn't a sort of pat answer for that, unfortunately. But I think if you were to get one of these databases really sort of robustly put together, I think you could start to give really interesting answers to a question like that. To say, what can you learn about the people who were doing the acknowledgements if you start looking at what the set of acknowledgements are for a specific community? But, and again, this is why I didn't just start writing down acknowledgements. There's an editor and a journal in between the writer and the acknowledgement. So some journals don't allow acknowledgement sections. Journals also change their practices, right? Editorial processes change. So it's important then to be able to say this acknowledgement was found in this context, but then back out to exactly which source it came from. So were you entering that data from a PDF? Were you entering it from an online database somewhere else? Were you taking it from a bibliography in some other source? And so that's why I wound up down this rabbit hole of actually designing sort of the most general solution to this as far as the database goes. Because as historians, we don't care about the abstract relationship. We want to be able to query that abstract relationship and then get back to these fine details about exactly what context something appeared in and exactly what the relationship was when it was written down, and not when somebody sort of thought to go look for it.
That's great, thank you. And then Devin, I don't know if you want to ask your question live to Darren that you've put in the Q&A.
Sure, yeah. So I really liked this talk, and I appreciated your comment about sort of running into more work than you thought you were going to have with the assets. I'm curious, so I have never taken on a development project this size before. This is way, I mean, I had experience with scientific computing, but there's a whole spectrum of things that were way bigger in this than I had realized. And so I'm curious if you had done a lot of game development already and you sort of had an idea about figuring out a timeline for a new project, or if this was new for you and you actually sort of, what ways did you start to think about how you could figure out how much work you had in front of you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's one of those questions that is really important for my purpose, right? So then my purpose of telling about my process is to help other people do it. But in order for other people to do it, they're going to want to know hard deadlines. It's not a personal project. We're like, a couple of years. Whereas for me, it was, it'll be over when it's over. I didn't have any previous experience. I had previous knowledge of Unity, how to make basic scenes in Unity, enough to know that no one would want to do that if I told them to do that. And that's, for me, it would extend my time. So that's why I chose Twine, because it's based in HTML and CSS. I also had some knowledge of, website design. And because anything visual is essentially a visual illusion that you can sort of figure out, like, based on what I know, how do I make it look like this is happening? Like, well, I don't know a good way, but I know a way, and then I sort of just do it. So in that sense, that's why I chose this particular way. It's because I had some concept that I can take someone else's library and make it work. The main mechanic in my game is clicking and dragging, and that there's a JavaScript library for that. So I didn't have to write that. You just have to make it work, right? But in terms of making a timeline, it's all about iterative design. So first started with, I want 3 scenes with placeholder text to prove I can do this. So then I first make 3 separate scenes. Then, okay, I figured out how to make that work. How do I make 5 scenes with 3 different levels? And okay, make that work. That's another couple months. So by working iteratively, you sort of have an idea that, okay, making 3 scenes took me 2 months. If I make 5 more scenes and I already know how to do it, that's about another month. And then you do that in the next iteration. I want 40 scenes, and then that took, oh my God, a long time. Yeah, so just doing it iteratively. Don't start with, I want to make my whole game. Start with, I want to prove the concept, and then I want to prove I can make the assets, and then I just have to times that by 10. That's a pretty good way of doing it. I hope that was a good answer.
That's great, thank you. And then our final question is from Sue Lemus, who has a question for Devin. And the question is, how does the database work with sources that are not digitized? Is this work paired with something like digital editions?
Yeah, so I'm primarily concerned with sources that are like halfway digital or not digitized, right? So there are PDFs of almost all the articles that I want to look at online, but they're not OCR'd in a way that is meaningful. And so I spend my time, I have 2 windows open. I have a PDF and I have 2 text files, and I'm transcribing across from the PDF into the text file. So I don't have a book in front of me, but I sort of might as well have in a lot of cases. So this database system is designed specifically so that you can handle a really wide variety of sources, and you design your input method to handle whatever it is that you're working with. And so it was really important to me to sort of solve a specific research problem with this project, and then make this system applicable for solving research problems that people can define, rather than doing my dissertation or sort of telling historians how a database is supposed to work in historical scholarship, because I don't know the answer to that question. So it's up to somebody using this system to decide how it would fit into something like digital editions or the archives that they have in front of them. My hope is that that if people want to use this, that they will be able to design an input method that fits their project and allows them to sort of start solving the problems they want to solve, instead of kind of working with a clunky piece of software that is more in their way than they want.
Wonderful, thank you, Devin. So that brings us to the end of our postgraduate panel. I'd like to thank both of our wonderful speakers. We've heard 2 fascinating papers, both part of wider projects that are clearly making huge interventions in their field and in the field of digital history. Thank you to our audience and for your questions, and to our speakers for answering them so generously. Before we go, I'm just going to alert you to our next seminar in the Digital History Seminar Series, which is on the 28th of February 2023, and it will be the second of our postgraduate panels. This seminar is in person, but will also, as always, be available online too. So thank you to the audience, thank you again to our wonderful speakers, and we hope to see you all at a future seminar soon.
Great, thanks.